One, cool. We are live. So I'm really excited about this conversation. As I was telling all three reps, we finally got through this election cycle. We, finally have a majority of our races settled, and now session is bearing down on us with session starting within the next 2 months. And there's going to be a lot of things on the board, and all three wonderful reps who are on right now will have a huge hand in the upcoming session. So with that being said, I want to introduce everyone and then just dive into the different topics we'll be chatting about. So the first person I want to introduce is State Rep Donna Howard. She has served in the Texas House of Representatives since 2006. She is a member of the House Appropriations Committee and sits on its Article 3 subcommittee, which oversees education spending in the state budget. Rep Howard is the vice chair of the House Administration Committee and is also a longtime member of the Higher Education Committee. A native of Austin, Rep Howard earned a bachelor's degree in nursing and a master's degree in health education from the University of Texas. She worked as a critical care nurse at Brackenridge and Seton Hospitals and served as Austin's first hospital-based patient education coordinator. Rep Howard is a past president of the Texas Nurses Association District 5 and was a health education instructor at UT. Rep Howard was elected to the EANS, is that right?
Yeah.
EANS ISD board in West Austin for the 1996 to 1999 term. She has served on the boards of Austin area Interreligious Ministries, Common Cause Texas, Texas Freedom Network, and the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. She now serves as a board member of the Expanding Horizons Foundation, supporting low-income housing and education. Her prior committee and work group appointments include the House Calendars Committee, Culture, Recreation, and Tourism Committee, Speaker Select Committee on Fiscal Impacts of Border Security, LCRA, Upper Basin Work Group, the Select Committee to determine sufficient balance of the Economic Stabilization Fund, the Joint...
There.
I'm sorry?
You can stop there.
Okay, I mean, you served on a lot of committees, so I just wanted to highlight that. Rep Howard, you were married to your wonderful husband, Derek Howard, for 40 wonderful years, and you proudly raised 3 wonderful children. You're also a grandmother to 6 perfect grandchildren, and you are active in your community and church. So thank you so much for being on tonight. Rep Zwiener, you are an author and educator, and you just served your first term in the Texas House of Representatives as a 5th-generation Texan. You are committed to bringing your values of healthy communities, inclusivity, and common sense to government to the Texas Ledge. You are a 3-time Jeopardy champion in 2012. I want to ask you questions about that later on. And you live in Driftwood with your husband Quincy, and you are the proud parents to your toddler Lark. And I remember working last session and just seeing your baby everywhere on the house floor. So very cute. So thank you for being on. And last but not least, Rep Goodwin, you represents Texas House District 47 in Western and Far South Travis County. As a member of the State House in the 86th legislative session, she was successful in passing a number of bills that serve her district and the state. She was a co-author of Landmark School Finance Reform, HB 3, as well as the Law Boosting Retired Teacher Pay SB 12. In addition, she authored and sponsored 5 bills directly affecting HD 47 that became law. In the upcoming session, Rep Goodwin will continue to advocate for the people of her district, the environment, a strong economy, and a strong, sound budget through her work in the Texas House. Rep Goodwin is a small business owner, a real estate broker, and a community leader. After graduating from the University of Texas with a BBA and the LBJ School of Public Affairs with a master's degree, Rep Goodwin remained in Austin and raised your children. And thank you for being on, Rep Goodwin. Cool. So with that, with all that being said, I kind of want to take a few steps back before taking steps forward. Kind of a recap of the 2019 session. I know for Rep Goodwin and Rep Zwiener, it was y'all's first session. So I guess just some highlights, maybe some bills that you guys either authored or co-authored that were signed into law, or maybe some solid legislation that you guys had drafted up that unfortunately didn't make it, that you'd like to see another shot at this upcoming session. So with that being said, let's kick it off with Rep Howard about the 2019 session.
Well, I know we'll all talk about this, but the HB3, the public education legislation, was probably one of the biggest achievements of the 2019 session. We actually were able, with bipartisan work, to put in another $6 billion to public education and $5 billion more into a property tax swap to give some property tax relief and shift more of the cost back onto the state in a true partnership, which had eroded over time as property values had increased. So that was a very significant thing that happened. I want to just let them talk about it too, but just real quickly, my office labels sessions, and I'll just go back a couple of sessions, but there are personalities and things that define what happens in a session. So in 2015, we ended up having what we don't have now, which is surplus dollars to work with. And instead of shoring up education and healthcare at the time, it was again used for some tax relief, which is obviously good, but did not take advantage of what we had at the time. And so we labeled that session Missed Opportunities, Misplaced Priorities. And then in 2017, we were totally focused on the bathroom bill, to the exclusion of all the other things that Texans really wanted us to be working on. Luckily, the communities came together. We had a strong defense, if you will, from the Speaker of the House at the time, Speaker Strauss. But we had law enforcement and the faith community and advocacy groups and just every single group, the business community, the tech community, all came forward and said, we cannot have discriminatory policies. That is not what we want to have here in Texas. And luckily that didn't pass. So our label for that session of 2017 was, it could have been worse. And then for last session, 2019, what we labeled that one was Elections Matter, because we had the wonderful women that you see here on this program tonight with me who were elected. We had 12 new Democrats come into the Texas House and bring us not a majority, anywhere near a majority, but at the same time, more of a presence and a message that Texans were saying, we want you to quit focusing on the bathroom. We want you to quit focusing on the social wedge issues and do the things we sent you there to do. And that is take care of the things that make a difference in the day-to-day lives of Texans. Education, access to higher education, making sure that you have access to healthcare, that we invest in the infrastructure necessary to support our economy, those kinds of things. And indeed, we did spend that time last session more focused than we had been on at least public education, and did not bring up the bathroom at all last session. There were some things that happened. I wouldn't say it was a perfect session, but the bottom line was that elections matter. And we can talk about it later in this interview, but I would say that the election we just went through is still going to have some importance in terms of dictating what happens in the session. But I'll stop right there and let my colleagues comment some too.
No, cool. Thank you so much for that. Rep Goodwin?
Sure. So another name for last session that I heard quite a bit from the speaker was the Kumbaya session. It was everybody coming together, a spirit of fairness. And I really felt like we did get some important work done with House Bill 3, school finance reform. My first bill that I got passed through the House was a financial literacy bill. It would have required high school students to have 1 semester of a financial literacy course. It's optional right now. It would just make it mandatory. And I have filed that already, so we'll be working on it again this session. Also had a highway safety bill because of, in my district, I have Highway 290, 71, 620, bee caves, a lot of roads where a lot of accidents happen. And in fact, a doctor died on Highway 71 just before session. And so we named the bill after him. Didn't quite get it passed, so I'll continue working on that one as well. the environment and climate change are really important to me. So both Rep. Zwiener and I are working very hard on some bills that will deal with the environment. And one of the bills that I did pass last session was a groundwater conservation district bill. The district had been set up the session before, but it wasn't really, the board wasn't able to do any work because they hadn't had a confirmation election. So that piece of legislation changed one thing from the prior bill. It was seemingly very, very simple. And you would not believe how many hours my staff had to spend talking to people to get the bill passed. But we did get it passed, and it did have the election in November 2019 passed by over 70%. So that was a great thing. And this session is going to be a rough session with the budget, with everything. And I just hope my fervent plan is to make sure that we keep our promise to public education and continue to fund it the way it needs to be funded, and that we make some movement on healthcare. Make sure every Texan can go see a doctor when they need to see a doctor.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And then Rep. Zwiener, same question.
Yeah, I think our freshman sessions are always interesting because we're having to learn the mechanisms of this new space we're in. And one of the things you learn very quickly that, everyone can tell you, but you don't truly get it until you're in the building, which is that it's really hard to pass a bill. And it's designed that way. There should be a high standard to change the laws of the state of Texas. I sort of thought of it as this way. It's like, it's not about figuring out how to pass a bill. It's figuring out how to keep your bill from finding a corner to die in, because they are all looking for a corner to die in. And there's all these steps where you have to keep things moving along the process. So I'm really grateful I was able to learn a lot about that process, including I have to give Rep. Howard a lot of credit for always being somebody that was there to help give us some ideas about how to get something that was stuck unstuck. We were able to pass 2 pieces of legislation that have become law. We had another one get through the House, but not the Senate. But one of those allowed the city of Buda to invest in aquifer storage and recovery, which is something that will hopefully reduce their reliance on the Edwards Aquifer in times of drought and help keep our streams and our springs healthier, while still providing water for that very fast-growing community. And then the other piece of legislation allowed some of our hill country cities that do a lot of dark skies tourism to use some of their hotel occupancy tax dollars specifically to help protect the night sky and get up-to-date light fixtures in that protect that astrotourism world, or the astrotourism work. So those were the legislation, or that was the legislation we moved last session. The bill that hangs in my head is one that we almost got there. It was the real close piece, and it was a piece of legislation that I'm filing again, have filed again, in partnership with Senator Zaffarini. And what this legislation would do is provide workplace sexual harassment protections to Texans at workplaces with 15 or fewer employees. Right now, if you work for a small employer, if you go to Texas Workforce Commission to make a sexual harassment complaint, they'll tell you, I'm sorry, we can't accept your complaint. There is no due process whatsoever for about 300,000 Texas workers who work for these small employers. And I think we can all agree that due process is better for everybody involved in a sexual harassment allegation. So that's something I hope we can get across the finish line this next session. It was set for the very last calendar. It was halfway down page 12, and we reached the top of page 12 on our deadline night. So I was just sitting there trying to move everybody along all night, but we didn't move quite fast enough. But the other thing that really sets in my mind, and I do want to acknowledge that House Bill 3 was huge and really important. But the other thing that really sets in my mind is some work that Rep. Howard and I were able to do together. I have a very good friend who was a victim of sexual assault here in Texas, and she got great investigators through her local law enforcement agency, built a really solid case, sent the case over to the DA's office, and they sat on it for over a year until her assailant was arrested for assaulting somebody else in Texas. And her case has moved along. The assailant has actually been prosecuted for the second assault and is currently in prison, and ended up publicly admitting to my friend's assault. But that was an assault that didn't need to happen if that district attorney had felt like they had the tools to move forward successfully on that case. And so we filed legislation to try and look into how different jurisdictions do with responding to sexual assault cases. And it's something where, again, I have to give Rep Howard's office a lot of gratitude here. There's more than one way to pass a bill. And Rep Howard is our budget wizard of the Democratic caucus. And so we've reached a point where we're running out of time to move the legislation. We're able to work with her staff to take some of our language and put it into a budget writer to get an audit report that we actually received a couple weeks ago from the state auditor's office looking at prosecutions. Now, obviously, I've been a little bit busy with an election, but now that we're past that, I'm very eager to dive into that and look for some solutions to make sure that every Texan has a fair access. Fair access to justice. And to me, I guess, I feel like I'm telling these stories of things that happened last session that build into next session, but that's really the way it works, is there's a lot of conversations we start that we know won't be finished in one session. And knowing that this is going to be a particularly tough year for us to pass anything because of the other things that are going to be on our plate. I mean, everyone's number one priority, I think, needs to be getting some healthcare expansion for Texans, and then making sure we have a budget and making sure we have fair maps. After those three things, everything else is going to be really, really hard because those three things are big projects. But we still have to tee up conversations that we'll continue to have over next session and the sessions to come.
If I can interrupt, I'm sorry, one more thing before you move on, and I'm sorry to do.
Yes, ma'am. No, not at all.
What you've just seen, and I hope you've seen, is that we work together on things. There's hardly anything that anybody does on their own. And we're really fortunate here in Central Texas to have really good working relationships and a really strong delegation that works together on things. So Aaron's mentioning the sexual assault legislation. I had a sexual assault survivors task force that's created a statewide task force, and we did this audit part 2 in the budget and got a lot of things in the budget that would help support that. Vicki Goodwin worked with me on safe storage of firearms, which is a recommendation that has come from the child fatality task force that the state health department has, because we have so many preschoolers in particular who either are injured or die from accessing unsecured firearms, as well as we have information that is given to us that suicides can be lessened if you don't have ready access to a firearm. But one of the biggest ones, which is one Vicki was intimately involved with, has to do with theft of firearms or taking someone's firearm that doesn't belong to them and using it to commit homicides and other horrible acts. The fact is that safe storage is just a kind of a no-brainer, and we couldn't get the bill through, but we got a rider into the budget. So we still are getting that campaign being developed, and Vicki can talk about it later if she wants to, but she was intimately involved with helping me with that. So we really do a lot of working together and trying to coordinate our efforts and support one another.
Yeah, no, that's very apparent through all the great work that you guys have done as an outside observer. So thank you for everything that you guys do. Thank you congrats once again on re-election for all three of y'all. And I'm so excited to have you guys back for another session. So before we get into this upcoming session, a lot of times folks don't realize that even when there's not a session, you guys are doing a lot of really great and important work. And I think 2020, I think it's fair to say, has been a crazy year. Everything from the pandemic to civil unrest. So if you guys want to kind of chat about things that you guys have done as state reps, or maybe your offices have done, or maybe stuff you guys did, during the campaign season to address, COVID-19, and just how much it's decimated, unfortunately, this country, the state, the city, and then everything that's happened with from George Floyd's murder, and in Austin, there's a gentleman, Mike Ramos, who was killed. So just kind of facing that and coming up with real solutions to address that. And let's kick it off with Rep Goodwin on that question.
Sure. So a lot of time was spent helping people to connect with the Texas Workforce Commission, because as you can imagine, soon after the pandemic hit, a lot of people lost their jobs. And we're having a hard time reaching TWC and getting the benefits that they needed to be able to buy food and stay in their housing. So that took a lot of time. We have a lot of constituents who come to us, and early on in the pandemic, we actually had a lot of phone conversations with different groups telling us how they were handling things, from the doctors and nurses and first responders, and just letting us know what it was like on the ground. And it's been a little frustrating not being able to do what we would like to do to provide all the testing. You know, the state hired a tracing company to do tracing, and that's never really gotten off the ground. In fact, when schools reopened, it's been up to the schools themselves to do the tracing. One of my staff members recently had a friend over for Halloween, and her friend tested positive for COVID-19, but my staff member never received a call saying, hey, you might need to quarantine. So her friend let her know, and so she did quarantine, but that should be through somebody calling and saying you were around somebody who was tested positive. So we just have failed in the state of Texas and in the US to really do the testing and tracing that we need to do to stop the spread. In fact, I had a conversation with Dr. Mark Escott last night, who pointed out that Australia has had fewer deaths than Travis County. And they have a program there called the Marshall Program, which basically is a way for people to make sure people are wearing their masks and following the rules in the different businesses. And so a lot of what we do as representatives in the interim is study and help constituents. And so that's essentially what I have been doing.
Cool. Thank you. Rep Zwiener?
Yeah, I want to echo some of what Rep Goodwin said, in particular that helping people with Texas Workforce Commission was pretty much all my staff did for about a month. And then we started to do some other things, but we actually got an email today from a Marine Corps veteran basically telling us that us helping him saved his life. And, you know, I think it's really important to not minimize what it means to connect people to the basic resources to be able to stay in their homes and keep food on the tables. And that's really what connecting people to Texas Workforce Commission was about this year for a lot of Texas families that very suddenly saw their income evaporate. It's something I know, you know, a lot of us have talked about a lot, that too many Texans are one diagnosis or one paycheck away from being homeless or from bankruptcy. And, you know, COVID-19 has had very dramatic impacts on our communities in a lot of different ways, but a lot of what it did was just make some of the vulnerabilities in our community so stark that we couldn't look away. Those are vulnerabilities that have been there. There are vulnerabilities that we've been concerned about and trying to address, but it made them, we saw what happened when large chunks of our population lost their income sources at the same time. And so it's something we still have a lot of work to do on. But yeah, I'm very glad that we were able to help provide those critical services to folks. The other thing we had to do a lot of, because, you know, I'm in the 4th fastest growing county in the nation here in Hays County, and we have a lot of growing pains, and one of those is just catching up with resources to serve the size of a community we have here. I mean, Hays County has grown 50% in the last 10 years. And, you know, so we don't have a very strong, robust public health department like the city of Austin does, like Harris County does, like Dallas does. And so we were doing a lot of the work of trying to get good information out on the ground to our communities. And that's something we've continued to do. But we, you know, did a series of virtual town halls talking about different issues related to the pandemic. And that was everything from having medical professionals on to just answer people's wild questions in March when nobody knew which way was up, to having people on to walk through the steps of applying for unemployment, to talking about school reopening and what that was going to look like. So I think providing good information is a really key service we can provide. And one of the ways we did that too was putting, you know, bilingual flyers together, both about why it was important to wear a mask, and whether or not you might be eligible for unemployment, and packaging those with a couple masks and distributing those to you know, our food pickups, both for our food banks and our various food pantries, to our school district food pickups over the summer, and then also just, you know, handing them out at other locations. We hung out outside one of the local Poco Locos and just handed those out to try and particularly reach some of the communities that weren't being talked to and that you can't reach very well on social media. And so for us, that process of getting information out was really, really critical. And then the last thing I'll mention too is we as state reps get to serve as conduits between the state and our local governments and try to get state resources on the ground. And, you know, up in Austin, there's 6 folks that can all go twist the state arm together. But I've got, 7 different communities. And so really trying to stay in touch with them, help them get answers about CARES Act relief money, et cetera. And then, but the thing I'm most proud of doing is really going to Texas Department of Emergency Management and making a case to get some testing down, particularly in our east side communities in Hays County. So we got testing in East Buda, East Kyle, East San Marcos, and it ended up being timed right with our summer case spike. And so we were able to help get folks that information about their positive test results so they could self-isolate and protect their loved ones and their colleagues, because we were able to get about 10,000 tests on the ground in the district by partnering between the county and Texas Department of Emergency Management. So that work of us trying to leverage some of the state resources and raising our hand and saying, hey, y'all are missing us because we're smaller, but we have a need here, is a really important role of people's local representatives.
Cool, thank you. And then Rep. Howard.
Well, we have a part-time legislature. We're only supposedly in session for 5 months every other year, and unless there's a special session. And so when we are in this interim, as we have been, I think a lot of times people probably don't understand what our role might be. And this has been a very strange interim because of the pandemic, and it has interfered with our usual methods of staying involved in things at the Capitol over the interim. I think Vicki was the one that mentioned, or one of you, that we use this as a time to study, for one thing, to do our homework to get ready for the next session. I was appointed to be on the Austin Chamber's task force for reopening business that met for several months with over 100 people from the community, looking at how could we safely reopen. What did we need to be paying attention to? It was really, I really appreciated the opportunity to hear from the local community, as well as to, as Aaron points out, be a conduit with what's going on at the state level. And I think that has been a lot of what we've been trying to do, is with what limited access we've had, since we haven't been able to get into the Capitol and actually have hearings, is what I've been referring to as oversight by letter. We typically have had a letter of the day that a legislator will put out because of some other grievance that we have, or something that we've seen that needs to be addressed. We're doing more than that, obviously, but it's been very frustrating, quite frankly, because the Capitol is closed. We can't have hearings, and that's usually where we can, dig deeper into what's going on, question things, bring things up that are of concern to our constituents. It's been dependent upon us as individual reps to, to work with the Texas Department of Emergency Management and the State Health Services and all the groups that are involved to try to advocate for our communities, and with some success for sure. But it's a very frustrating process when you aren't able to meet, you're not in session, and your hands are tied to a certain extent. That hasn't kept us from trying to do what we can do, and I think with some success. But it has been a very frustrating interim, I think, for all three of us. For me, since I focus so much on finances being a part of appropriations, one of the things that we did was we recently put out an infographic to try to show where the federal dollars have gone up to this point in time, and the billions of dollars that Governor Abbott still has at his disposal that he has not distributed at this point, with a deadline looming of December 30th, that those funds have to be expended or at least encumbered. And he hasn't been forthcoming with his plan for those funds when we have a lot of need in our communities. So we've really been pushing a lot on that too, trying to exert whatever pressure we can as legislators, but also asking the community, that anybody that has any leverage with the governor, to press on that as well, because it's very frustrating to know we have these needs, billions of dollars sitting there that haven't been distributed yet, that are going to go away if we don't. Very concerning to us is how we're going to make that happen.
Correct. I kind of want to go off of a point you made. before we dive into the session itself, it's going to be a weird session, right? It's been a weird year. I don't think it's going to be any different when it comes to session. How will session look like to you? Like, I don't imagine, normally anyone can walk into a state rep's office and take a meeting with either staff or the rep, and committee meetings and meetings on the floor and all that stuff that happens normally. And I'll say on you, Rep Howard. How do you think session will look like in the next 2 months?
Well, being a vice chair of House Administration, I was involved with a working group that has met a couple of times prior to this point in time. Since the election, the presumptive speaker has appointed a working group to look at it, which is basically the same people. So we're going to continue our work here. But, at the beginning of summer, we put some things in place in order to have some interim hearings. We put in some plexiglass in some committee hearing rooms, maintained some distancing in the audience, put up some large screen TV so we could have some virtual testimony going on, came up with a one way in, one way out, tried to look at how we could do this safely, but maintain transparency and public access. Unfortunately, the governor never chose to reopen the Capitol, and he is in charge of the State Preservation Board, which is responsible for the Capitol. So even though we put some things in place, we were never able to have those hearings because the Capitol is to this day still closed. We're hoping it will be open in January because it needs to be open for us to have our first day of session. The big challenge for us right now is, we're going to be coming into session January 12th on the right after we've had these holidays where people may gather again, and we're being the flu season and all the things that are already contributing to the rising case and hospitalization rates that we're seeing right now. No telling what's going to be happening by the time we're ready to open up January 12th of 2021. The Constitution requires that we convene in Austin. And so we will have to do that. We have no option to meet virtually. We don't have to meet at the Capitol. We could meet somewhere else in Austin, but we've been looking at various potential venues and still think it may be best to still be at the Capitol. Be masked, space ourselves out in the floor and the gallery of the chamber. It will limit the number of other people that can come in, but if we can get that first day under our belts where we can elect a speaker and adopt some rules, then we can adopt rules that allow us to have maybe some people attending from their office. Whatever we can end up doing here, we don't have the ability based on our rules to do it right now. So the biggest first challenge is to get through that first day of session. But clearly, it's not going to be the usual this session. We don't know how we're going to handle committee hearings. We don't even know if we're going to stay in session in Austin for any length of time. We may come in and then go back home for several weeks and then come back. We don't really know. Part of it depends on where we are with the virus at the time. That's going to dictate a lot of what we do. Our clear goals here are safety, transparency, and public access. That's guiding what we're trying to do. We've got to get through that first day of session and then create rules that allow us to be more nimble and to have more flexibility in how we do this.
Thank you. Rep Zwiener or Rep Goodwin, is there anything that y'all want to add about how y'all's offices will approach this upcoming session?
My staff have jokingly talked about locking the door, making sure people wear masks if they come in, probably not all of us being there at the same time. The one nice thing, actually, we have an intern who joined us this summer, and right after becoming an intern with us, she moved to France. And she's still my intern. So, I guess there's a small benefit to the world that we're in right now. And that's people can join in from all over the state or all over the world. So I hope that we're able to figure out allowing people to give testimony virtually or allowing us to vote on bills from our office. So it seems like we should be nimble enough to do that.
Yeah, I'll just add, one of the things we're really thinking about is how to try and protect that sense of access for the public and advocates. without, again, endangering my staff. Because it is going to be pretty high risk to be in the physical Capitol building this year, especially if we have the same type of norm of office visits going on. So we're kind of experimenting with how can we set up, a Zoom lobby so that people have the ability to do a drop-in, see if somebody's available for a meeting, and kind of recreate some of that experience. We are lucky at the technological capacity we have right now. It's far superior to the options people had in 1918 during the Spanish flu. And I think it's really important for us to take advantage of it and be very transparent with our constituents and the advocacy world with how to reach us effectively in a way that is safe for everyone.
Cool, thank you. So now let's just jump into session. 2021 session. Well, it's on the 2021 session, the year 2021. What are I guess goals and priorities for y'all's respective offices, or what are things that you guys would like to see done, past this session that might have not passed, previously, or something that you think we as a state really need? And let's kick this question off with Rep. Goodwin.
So the budget's going to be the number one thing and the tough thing. And like I said earlier, I think the biggest priority is to make sure that we continue our funding of public education from pre-K through college. That's going to be a really heavy lift just by itself. So I know that during the summer, there was a committee within the Democratic caucus that looked at some revenue ideas. I've had some conversations with some of the members of that committee because it's just in a time like now, how do you make sure that we don't hurt the people that we're here to serve? And certainly we don't want to raise taxes at a time like now. So what are some other options? Are there places in the budget where we can move things around? Of course, a lot of people I love the analogy, and I think it was Representative King who said it, with Medicaid expansion, it's a 10-to-1 or 9-to-1, deal. You put a dime on the table and you get $1 back. So basically, Texas puts in 10 cents, the federal government, the other 90. Why don't we do that? Because people need health care. We're going to be paying for it regardless. So I think that's one of the big issues that we'll be addressing. And then redistricting, oh my goodness, there's been a lot of conversations about that already. And that's going to take a lot of time and air in the room to try to make things a little bit more fair when it comes to our maps, and hoping that the Republicans will give us a seat at the table.
Cool, thank you. Rep. Zwiener?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Rep. Goodwin said, and I'll even steal a line from Rep. Howard before she speaks it, and say we can't balance the budget on the backs of our children, and that's really critical. And I think we all are going to be very vigilant to try and prevent that from happening. And of course, this question of Medicaid expansion is so important because it does three things. One is it helps us with our budget because of the amount of money it brings in. Two, it helps our economy because that money funnels down to healthcare workers. And it's not something that's been talked about as much, but a lot of medical offices have financially struggled during the pandemic because folks quit seeking routine care. Folks quit doing things that were less urgent, and they still had to pay their bills and pay for their office, pay for their staffs. So that infusion of money will also help make sure that people are either put back to work or stay working. And then, of course, the real driver of this, it provides more people access to healthcare. And if we have learned nothing else from this pandemic, I hope we have learned that we are only as healthy as the sickest member of our community. And that having access to healthcare is not just an issue for an individual, it's an issue for our entire community. So that is a huge priority. I'm really grateful that we have, senior members that will be working very hard on both of these issues. And am happy to be in a support role on these for folks like Rep. Howard and Rep. Coleman, who've really been in the weeds of how to make these issues happen on the ground. from my office personally, I really want to pass that sexual harassment bill that we barely missed passing last session. I think it's really meaningful to try and give some basic workplace protections to another 300,000 Texas workers. And then the other area I'm looking a lot at is enforcement for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And, I know, again, this is a tough year. Environment sometimes feels a little bit squishier, but we've seen worse health outcomes for people who live in areas that are affected by air pollution. And that's almost certainly one of the factors in the disproportionate impact on our Hispanic and Black communities, is living in areas where they're more exposed to air pollution. So to me, it is urgent. We also have seen several catastrophic incidences related to facilities not keeping up with maintenance and therefore having a big fire. The ITC fire is the one that got a lot of the press coverage, but there's been several incidents just in the past few years. So for me, making sure Texas Commission on Environmental Quality has the teeth they need to be effective and encourage a culture of compliance in our industry is critical. And so I'm actually had a call with the executive director of TCEQ today. We're looking on trying at several things, including trying to tie their penalty amounts to inflation so that every time they need to be raised, they don't have to come beg the legislature to pass a bill. Instead, we can just tie them to inflation. And then we're also looking at trying to address some issues like the affirmative defense loophole, where a lot of folks are able to just check a box and not pay a fine, as well as giving them abilities to leverage higher fines when there is an incident that really, truly is catastrophic.
Thank you. And Rep. Howard.
Yeah, they've touched on a lot of this. The fact is that we left last legislative session with a $3 billion surplus when we passed our 2-year budget. We got a revised estimate from the comptroller this summer based on the COVID-induced recession and the downturn in the oil industry, to coming from a $3 billion surplus to a $4.6 billion shortfall for the current 2-year budget that we're in, which ends August 31st of 2021. So we have some challenges just filling the holes in our current budget, much less looking at how we're going to address needs in the 2-year budget that we will be passing when we come back in session. So this is really, I think, consuming a lot of us in terms of how are we going to be able to sustain those things that are necessary right now, especially when Texans need them. When they've lost their jobs, when they've lost their health insurance, when their children are needing additional resources because of all the virtual learning that is obviously and not always ideal, especially when you don't have the broadband connectivity in place to allow everyone to have the same access to the internet and to the broadband capabilities. It's just issue after issue, higher education, all of it. And the state leadership has been talking about tightening our belts. Well, the way I put it is we already have a lean budget. There's not any more notches really in that belt. The fact is that we have a low budget state, a low taxation state, which has resulted in having a limited budget. At the very same time that we're going to be needing to invest in Texans so that we can continue to move forward and as we try to recover. That means we've got to make sure that kids have the education they need. We have the educated workforce pipeline. We're doing retraining because, well, one of the things I learned in the Austin Chamber task force that I was a part of, a report came out that indicated that 35 to 40% of the jobs that were lost due to the pandemic are not coming back. We've got to make sure that people have what they need to retrain and get the new jobs that this disruptive economy is creating. Yes, there are some things that have gone away. There are other things that are going to be built up, and we need to have the workforce to staff those things. Clearly, we need to have the healthcare access. And as Vicki pointed out, with a 9-to-1 match, it is really foolish of us to leave our income tax dollars that we have paid to the federal government, to leave them on the table and not bring them back to help Texans, we have already lost somewhere in the ballpark of $100 billion that we could have been bringing into Texas because we have refused, for ideological reasons, to expand Medicaid. That being said, even if we can't get our colleagues on to totally expanding it, we want to at least see some areas that we could make some difference. So for instance, I'm now the chairperson of the Women's Health Caucus. One of our main priorities is going to be to expand postpartum coverage of Medicaid from the current 2 months to 12 months. The majority of the maternal morbidity and mortality issues that Texans experience, where we lose moms, are up to a year postpartum. Right now, 2 months after they deliver their babies, they're kicked out of the program and they can get into another state program. But all of those transitions result in gaps, result in lack of providers who are available in the different programs. It just has not worked. If we could expand that coverage, we could save the lives of moms. And we know that that's critically important, obviously, in healthy families, to have a healthy mom who can raise the children in that home. So we say we value life. We say we value mothers and families. This is one of the ways we need to put our money where our mouths are and make sure we're doing everything we can to support women who have babies, who have families, so that they can continue to take care of those families. So at the very least, we want to expand Medicaid coverage postpartum.
Thank you guys for oh yeah.
And if you don't mind, I want to add just a little bit, which is to say, you know, we're all coming off a tough campaign cycle. I think the people you have on this call wished some of the results had been a little different. But one thing that gives me a lot of hope about us taking some action, both on Medicaid expansion and also us, being defensive of our public education budget, is a lot of the folks who had tough races and came back because they made promises around healthcare and education. And I think some of our work next session is going to be holding them to those promises. Yes.
Cool. Thank you. So you kind of want to touch on something that I think all three of you might have mentioned. So in 2002, Republican takeover of the Texas House. It was the first time in 130 years, and now it looks like Republicans will continue to have control of the House at least until the next redistricting until 2031. So with unfortunately how some of the results went on election night on the state level, how can Democrats in the House and how can folks who are volunteers and constituents, how can we curtail Republican efforts towards unfair maps or this redistricting that's going to occur? Rep. Goodwin.
I know the group Fair Maps Texas has been asking for 30 days to review maps after they're done, and to allow the public that chance to have a say in how the maps are drawn. So I think that's really important. I don't know if we're going to be able to get anything like that passed before redistricting work begins, but I think that would be something that maybe both sides can agree on, just allowing that time for public input. Other than that, we should be using computer programs. I've had a constituent reach out to me saying there's a department at Texas State University actually that has some software that could do the maps, and I think that would be a great start, just to have some unbiased input into the process. Those are a couple of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, some of these districts, especially on the congressional level, are ridiculous. I know like Texas 2, Texas 25, just the way it's drawn, it's horrendous. Rep. Zwiener, same question.
So on the note of Texas 25, I got a pony this summer for my daughter, and one of the names we considered was Jerry, short for gerrymander. Because I live in the southern end of Congressional District 25, and I drove the full length of the congressional district to pick this pony up from Weatherford, Texas. And I never fully appreciated the size until I did a 10-hour round trip to get a pony. Anyway, his name's now Cloud because my daughter liked that better. But no, I think it's really important for members of the community to be engaged in the redistricting process. And obviously that's all going to look a little different this year. There were a fair number of redistricting committee hearings traveling the state before the pandemic hit, and then a lot of those were canceled. But if you're in a place where you've been gerrymandered and your community has been cut up in a way that doesn't make sense, tell us and tell the redistricting committee, look for opportunities to submit testimony to say that, hey, my school district got cut in half and that's made it harder for us to reach out to our member of Congress. Hey, my city's been cut in half and here's how that impacted us. Or an example in my district, my university's cut in half between 2 different congressional districts right through the middle of our student center. This doesn't make sense. It makes it hard for us to be engaged. And so some of what our job as a minority party is to do during redistricting is to build a record of why these maps don't make sense if they come out and don't make sense, which is, probable. But some of our job is to build that record, and members of the community can help us build that record by telling their story of how their community is cut up in a way that doesn't make sense and minimizes their ability to reach out to their elected officials. So I really encourage everybody to look for those opportunities. We'll certainly amplify them as they start to happen again. And I'm sure my colleagues all will as well.
Let me just say that y'all are mentioning the congressional districts. If you look at not only Travis County, but also Austin, which goes into some of Williamson County, we actually have 6 congressional districts here in our area when our population could easily limit that to 2 within Travis County and Austin. The argument that was given tongue-in-cheek, I guess you could say, by those that were pushing this before was, hey, you're going to have 6 reps instead of 2, so you'll be even better represented. Well, clearly that's not the case, because not a single one of those 6 has even 25% of Austin in their district. They all go miles and miles away, and though Austin is a part of their district, they don't represent a common group of Austinites. It's ludicrous what has happened. And unfortunately, with the way the election came out, it's going to be a Republican speaker, lieutenant governor, and governor. And the Legislative Redistricting Board, which takes the maps if the Senate and the House don't agree on a map, which oftentimes is the case, that 5-member board are all 5 leading Republican statewide office holders. The only thing that really is of hope to us right now is that things will go to the courts. Now, again, the courts have shifted under Trump to where we have a lot of his appointees on these courts now, including obviously the Supreme Court. Don't know what that's going to mean, but the fact is that we know what the demographics show have been happening in our state, and our districts need to reflect those demographics. The way I describe gerrymandering is that it's basically a way to virtually stuff the ballot box. You are drawing maps to stuff the ballot box with those voters that you want to have voting in a particular district. And that's not the way this should be working. Vicki mentioned computers. Absolutely, we could easily come up with some fair maps by feeding into a programmed system that would spew things out to us, that would try to keep jurisdictions aligned, look at natural boundaries, keep communities of interest together, so you're not standing on a street corner and you see 4 different congressional districts like you can do here in Travis County. That's ridiculous. We've had young people. There's some young people, high school and college age siblings in my district who came up with a game of how to gerrymander and to give people education about how you can actually address the district maps. And then just today, I haven't read it yet, so I don't have all the information, but I saw that there were some students, some middle school STEM students who won an award for coming up with a way to address gerrymandering. I mean, this is something that our kids can do. And we need to do it for them, address this and have fair maps, because it does impact for the next decade what can be done in elections, as we just saw. Vicki and Aaron both had very close races. They could talk about that. Very close races. They might not have won had they not done all the work that was done and all of the people that have volunteered and helped to make that happen. And part of the reason that's an issue is because of gerrymandering. We're working under maps that were specifically drawn to make it difficult for Democrats to win. And that's the challenge we're going to have in the next decade, is how do we impact things when we don't have the majority? How do we still have an impact? And that's where I think the public is going to come into play. The public needs to push against us and make sure that your voices are heard about what you expect in terms of representation.
Very true and very well said. So that is it with my questions, but I actually got a question from someone. I think it's kind of a fun question. Maybe it's not. But the question is, who is your favorite member from the opposite side to work with? So don't know if this is a fun question or not. And maybe the answer is no one, maybe the answer is several people. But Rep Goodwin, who was your favorite Republican to work with last session?
Actually, two come to mind. I have to say, Angie Chen Button. She was the chair of Urban Affairs, and I was on that committee. And she was very helpful in a couple of situations where I needed a vote to get a bill out of committee. And she was helpful with that. And then Travis Clardy was on the Homeland Security and Public Safety Committee with me. And there was one vote on a gun bill that he was surprised at which way I voted. And he said, he kind of elbowed me and he's like, are you sure? Did you know what we're voting on? I said, it's okay. I've already checked with the advocates and they're good with it. So, every once in a while you have a relationship with a member of the opposite party that goes well.
Cool. Rep Zwiener?
I feel like this is kind of a gotcha question, not for us, but for the members we potentially say nice things about. I feel like this is how we get them in trouble in primaries. But I'll mention two that I was able to work really well with. Rep Terry Wilson, who represents part of Williamson County, Milam County, and Burnett County. He very conservative, but we both have issues with rock quarries and concrete batch plants in our district. And we were able to work closely to build some momentum on that issue last session. We weren't able to move any big bills last session, but we were able to eventually get some momentum and convince the speaker to appoint a special interim committee on aggregate production operations. And he's been chairing that committee, and I'm a member of it. And so I'm hopeful we're going to have some opportunities to move legislation forward on that this session. The other person I'll mention is Rep Dwayne Burns, who actually represents the Cleburne area. And he was carrying legislation on eminent domain reform. And I, about a month before my 2018 election, learned there was a 42-inch natural gas pipeline coming across my district. And so he and I were able to work together. And it was a lot of fun because I got to be the scary Democrat to his reasonable rural Republican in a lot of negotiation rooms. And I'd be like, I don't think Dwayne's going far enough, but I'm going to trust him. But if I ever get in charge of this. So we had a lot of fun working together. And I think the thing that's really important in the building is, you have to be guided by your values. And there are some issues that you can't work with people on, but there are others you can. And when you can, it's really important to put aside whatever other baggage there is or the times you've disagreed and do the work for the people of Texas where your values align.
Cool. Rep Howard, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to be politically astute here and say, I'm sure the one I worked best with, I'm sure, was Dave Phelan, our presumptive speaker.
Donna, he's the one who least needs us to say nice things about him, though, right now.
If each of you combine, name 6 folks, maybe they'll all lose their election in 2022 and we'll flip the house.
Really though, people need to. We are not Washington. We really do get along a lot better. We don't have the same kind of divisions that you see in Washington. Clearly, we have some battles, and clearly we have some differences. And we work very hard during the political part of the season on that. When we get into the policy part, where we're actually meeting together, trying to come up with solutions that help Texans, we find a lot of opportunities to work together on things. And we seek those, because the greater the coalitions that you can build, the more success you're going to have. And there are a lot of very good people who are misguided in their way they look at things, but still some very good people at the Capitol who share a lot of our values. They want strong communities. They want good public schools. They want health care. They want a lot of the same things we do. They have different ideas about how to go about doing it. But when we can find that common ground and find some common solutions together, it really allows us to be more successful and to move forward. And, if we stayed in our corners and didn't try to work together on solutions, we would get nowhere. But by working together, we at least can hopefully get to some incremental change that's positive, that makes a difference. And there's a lot of Republicans that I know I work with and that I value and call friends, actually. But we, in the campaign season, all bets are off, because we're trying to increase our numbers, because we want to be able to have our majority to guide that agenda. That's what this is all about.
Cool. Thank you. I think that was a nice way to end this. I want to thank you all for being on, and once again congratulate all three of you on the re-election, especially Rep. Zwiener and Goodwin. Hard-fought re-election campaigns, but so very happy to have you guys representing Central Texas. Very excited to see all the great work that you guys will do in this upcoming session, and yeah, best of luck to all that. I hope you guys have a great rest of the night, and just can't thank you guys enough for being on tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks.